Hey everyone, welcome back. Really glad you're here today because what we're going to talk about in this episode is something that I think is going to genuinely surprise a lot of you. And honestly, it might make you a little bit angry. Not at me, I hope, but at the information you've been given over the years about what healthy eating actually looks like. Here's the situation. I talk to people every single week who are doing everything right, or at least everything they've been told is right. They're eating their whole grains. They're having fruit smoothies for breakfast. They're choosing the low-fat options at the grocery store. They're counting their calories, and yet they're still gaining weight. They're still exhausted all the time. They're still experiencing brain fog that won't lift. They're still getting lab results that their doctor is increasingly worried about. And the devastating truth, the thing that I want to spend the next 22 minutes really unpacking with you, is that in many cases, it's not their fault. They are not failing their diet. Their diet is failing them. Because the healthy labels on so much of our food mask a biological reality that our bodies simply cannot handle. A leading UK primary care physician and award-winning expert in metabolic health has spent years documenting this crisis in his patients. And his conclusion is stark. The world is, in his words, sleepwalking into a metabolic disaster. Today, we're going to talk about 5 deeply important things his work reveals. Things that have the power to completely reframe how you think about food, blood sugar, body weight, and your long-term health. We're going to cover the shocking sugar content of foods you probably eat every day. We're going to talk about what's really happening inside your bloodstream after a healthy meal. We are going to discuss why your waistline is a more important health metric than your weight. We're going to look at the real cost, measured in days of your life, of chronic high blood sugar. And we're going to address something that almost nobody in mainstream medicine talks about honestly: food addiction, and why just eat less is not a solution for a significant portion of the population. By the end of this episode, I want you to have a completely different framework for understanding what you're eating and why it matters. Not just for your weight, but for your brain, your arteries, your liver, your cancer risk, and ultimately, the quality of the years you have ahead of you. All right, let's start with what I think is the single most powerful piece of nutritional education that most people have never received. And once you understand this, you will never look at a plate of rice or a bowl of cereal the same way again. Here's the concept. Starchy carbohydrates are, at a molecular level, glucose molecules holding hands. That's not a metaphor, that's chemistry. Starch, whether it's in bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, or breakfast cereals, is literally a long chain of glucose molecules bonded together. And the moment you begin digesting that food, your digestive enzymes go to work breaking those bonds, releasing all of that glucose as free sugar into your bloodstream. So when you eat a bowl of rice, you're not really eating complex carbohydrates in any meaningful physiological sense. You're eating sugar in a slightly delayed delivery format. Now, this is where something called glycemic load becomes essential. You might have heard of the glycemic index. That's the measure of how quickly a particular food raises blood sugar. But the glycemic index has a significant limitation. It doesn't account for how much of that food you actually eat. Glycemic load corrects for that. It takes into account both the quality of the carbohydrate and the quantity you're consuming, giving you a far more accurate picture of the actual metabolic impact of a meal. And when you apply glycemic load thinking to common healthy foods, the results are genuinely startling. A serving, just 150 grams of boiled white rice, that's the equivalent of 10 teaspoons of sugar entering your bloodstream. 10. A large baked potato, 9 teaspoons. A standard bowl of plain cornflakes, not the sugary kind, the plain healthy kind, 8 teaspoons. A ripe banana, 6 teaspoons. To make this tangible for patients, the approach is to physically place sugar cubes on the table next to photographs of these foods. A visual that is quite literally worth 1,000 words. Because when someone sees 10 sugar cubes sitting next to their lunch, something shifts in their understanding in a way that no amount of verbal explanation achieves. And this is not just about obviously starchy foods. There's a phenomenon called the health halo that surrounds fruit-based products, and it is leading a lot of well-intentioned people astray. Dried fruit, raisins, dates, dried apricots, the things many people eat as a healthy snack or add to their granola, is typically 60 to 70% sugar by weight. The dehydration process concentrates the natural sugars while removing the water, leaving you with something that is metabolically very similar to candy. Fruit juice and smoothies present a similar problem, and this one surprises people more. When you eat a whole piece of fruit, the fiber in that fruit slows down the absorption of its natural sugars. It creates a buffering effect that moderates the blood sugar response. But when you juice that fruit, or blend it at high speed in a smoothie, you break down or remove that fiber. What you're left with is a liquid sugar delivery system that hits your bloodstream fast, hard, and with very little metabolic resistance. The reaction from patients when they truly internalize this information for the first time is often one of genuine shock, and then, understandably, anger. Consider this kind of story. A woman successfully reverses her type 2 diabetes through a low-carb dietary approach, and then she confronts her doctor. She says something along these lines: "In the last 10 years, did you ever once tell me that bread was sugar? That breakfast cereals were sugar? I had to learn that online. And when I cut those foods, I didn't need your medication anymore." That's a powerful statement, and the hard truth embedded in it is that for decades, patients have been given dietary advice: eat more whole grains, choose low-fat options, fruit is always healthy, that was not informed by a genuine understanding of glucose metabolism and glycemic load. The calories in, calories out model that dominated nutritional guidance for 40 years simply did not capture the molecular reality of what different macronutrients do inside the body. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here. I'm not saying that all carbohydrates are evil, or that fruit is bad for you, or that everyone needs to go zero carb immediately. That is not the message. The message is that there is a huge gap between what we've been told about these foods and what the science of glucose metabolism actually shows. And bridging that gap, really understanding how specific foods impact your blood sugar, is the first and most fundamental step toward metabolic health. Now that you understand how much sugar is hiding in common foods, I want to tell you something about the human body that puts this in even starker perspective. In a healthy adult human body, approximately 5 liters of blood, the total amount of glucose circulating in the bloodstream at any given moment is about 1 teaspoon. 1 single teaspoon of sugar. That's it. That is the exquisitely narrow biological window within which your body is designed to operate. 1 teaspoon. And you just ate the equivalent of 10. Think about what that means for a moment. When you eat a standard serving of rice, or a bowl of cornflakes, or a large potato, you are flooding a system that is designed to hold 1 teaspoon of sugar with 10 times that amount in a very short window of time. Your body has to respond to that, and it does, rapidly and forcefully, through a massive release of insulin. Insulin is the hormone produced by the pancreas, whose job is to clear excess glucose from the blood, to push it into the cells of muscle and liver and adipose tissue for storage or use. And in the short term, this system works. Insulin goes up, blood sugar comes down, crisis averted. But here's the problem. This system was designed to handle occasional surges in blood glucose. A piece of fruit here, a root vegetable there. It was not designed to handle 3 large insulin spikes per day, every day, for decades. When you chronically overstimulate the insulin response, several very bad things start to happen. First, the cells, particularly in muscle and liver tissue, start to become resistant to insulin signal. They've been hearing that alarm so frequently and at such high volume that they begin to tune it out. This is insulin resistance, and it is the foundational pathology underlying type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and a host of other conditions. Second, as insulin resistance develops, the pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to achieve the same blood sugar lowering effect. This state, chronically elevated insulin levels, is called hyperinsulinemia, and hyperinsulinemia is itself deeply damaging. It promotes fat storage, particularly around the abdomen and in the liver. It drives cellular proliferation in ways that increase cancer risk. It disrupts hormonal balance, contributing to conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome. Third, and this is one that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention, there is the matter of the glycocalyx. This is a microscopic layer of proteoglycans and glycoproteins that lines the interior surface of your blood vessels. Think of it as the non-stick coating on the inside of your arteries. When it's intact and healthy, it prevents blood cells and platelets from sticking to the arterial wall, reduces inflammatory signaling, and protects the vascular endothelium from damage. Research shows that high blood sugar can begin to damage the glycocalyx within just 6 hours of a glucose spike. 6 hours. And once that protective layer is compromised, the stage is set for the progressive arterial damage that eventually manifests as cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, peripheral vascular disease. This is what gets described as the long, silent scream of the liver. Because this damage, the insulin resistance, the glycocalyx degradation, the accumulating metabolic dysfunction, can proceed silently for a decade or more before it shows up as a diagnosis of diabetes or a cardiovascular event. The person feels fine. Their standard blood tests might look normal, but underneath the surface, the damage is accumulating steadily. And this is precisely why understanding glycemic load and managing blood sugar is not just relevant for people who already have diabetes. It is relevant for every single person who cares about their long-term health, because the metabolic trajectory you are on right now, today, is being shaped by what you ate for breakfast this morning. All right, let's talk about body fat, but in a way that's probably different from how you've heard it discussed before. Most of us are familiar with BMI, body mass index, as the standard tool for assessing whether someone's weight is in a healthy range. And BMI has its uses, but it has a critical limitation. It doesn't tell you anything about where fat is stored in the body. And where your fat is stored turns out to matter enormously, arguably more than how much fat you have in total. There are two fundamentally different types of body fat, and they are not metabolically equivalent. Subcutaneous fat is the fat stored just beneath the skin, the kind you can pinch on your thighs, your arms, your hips. This type of fat is not metabolically benign, but it is relatively inert. It stores energy, it provides some insulation and cushioning, and it responds reasonably well to diet and exercise interventions. It is not ideal to have excess subcutaneous fat, but it is not immediately dangerous in the same way as the other type. Visceral fat is a completely different story. This is the fat stored deep within the abdominal cavity, packed around the organs, infiltrating the liver, wrapping around the intestines, crowding the pancreas. And visceral fat is metabolically active in all the wrong ways. It releases inflammatory cytokines directly into the portal circulation, the blood supply feeding your liver. It releases free fatty acids that interfere with insulin signaling. It physically crowds the pancreas and liver, impairing their ability to regulate glucose metabolism. In other words, visceral fat doesn't just sit there. It actively participates in making your metabolic health worse. And the really important clinical point is that you cannot reliably assess visceral fat from a standard BMI measurement. Someone can have a technically normal BMI while still carrying a dangerous amount of visceral fat, particularly if they're what we sometimes call skinny fat, relatively lean on the outside, but carrying hidden adiposity around their organs. So, how do you assess visceral fat in a practical, low-cost way? One beautifully simple method is called the string test. And I love this approach because it requires no equipment, no lab, no clinic visit. Here's how it works. You cut a piece of string to exactly your height. You fold that string in half. You then take that folded string and check whether it can wrap around the widest circumference of your abdomen, typically at the level of your belly button. If the string fits comfortably, your waist is less than half your height, and that's generally a reassuring sign from a visceral fat perspective. If the string doesn't fit, if your waist is more than half your height, that indicates an accumulation of central adiposity that should be taken seriously as a clinical warning sign. The underlying principle here is simple. For most people, a healthy waist circumference should be less than half their height. This ratio has been validated in research as a robust predictor of metabolic risk, better, in many studies, than BMI alone. Now here's something important I want to address directly. Our culture has normalized a significant degree of central adiposity. The dad bod has become almost a term of affection, something we laugh about, accept, perhaps even celebrate as a sign of a life well lived. But from a metabolic standpoint, a protruding abdomen is often the first visible manifestation of years of metabolic stress. It is the outward sign of a liver infiltrated with fat, of a pancreas struggling to keep up with insulin demand, of a cardiovascular system under increasing pressure. That's not about aesthetics. That's not about cultural ideals of body shape. That's about biology. And the normalization of central obesity as just getting older or just how I'm built is in many cases obscuring a genuine clinical warning sign that deserves attention and intervention. The good news, and there is genuinely good news here, is that visceral fat is typically more metabolically responsive than subcutaneous fat. When people make meaningful dietary changes, particularly reducing their glycemic load, visceral fat is often the first type to mobilize. People begin to notice their waistline changing relatively quickly, and that physical change reflects real improvements in liver function, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory burden. I want to talk numbers now, because I think sometimes the reality of what chronic metabolic dysfunction actually costs us in terms of our lives, our years, our independence, doesn't land with the weight it deserves. We talk about health risks in abstract terms. We know high blood sugar is bad for you. But what does that actually mean in concrete, measurable terms? Let's start with a figure from UK population health data that I find genuinely sobering. Based on data from national statistics offices and major health foundations, every year spent with poorly controlled type 2 diabetes results in the loss of approximately 100 days of life expectancy. 100 days per year of poorly controlled diabetes. Think about that compounding effect. If someone is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at 55 and lives with poorly controlled blood sugar for 20 years, we're talking about a potential loss of over 2,000 days, roughly 5.5 years of life expectancy. And those aren't just any years. The years lost are disproportionately the healthier, more active, higher quality years of life. Now, here is where I want to expand this beyond diabetes specifically, because metabolic dysfunction affects far more people than just those with a formal diabetes diagnosis. In the UK, and this trend is mirrored in most Western countries, overall life expectancy has largely plateaued. We're not dying that much younger than we were 20 years ago. But here is the truly alarming shift. Healthy life expectancy is actively declining. The data suggests that the average person can now expect around 60 years of genuinely good health, years free from significant chronic illness, disability, or debilitating symptoms. And yet average life expectancy in many Western countries is 80 or above. Do the math. That means the average person spends the final 20 to 23 years of their life in a state of chronic illness. 20 years of doctor's appointments, of medications, of things you can no longer do, of independence gradually eroded. That is the hidden cost of metabolic neglect. Not premature death necessarily, but years and years of compromised living. And then there's the cancer connection, which I think is even more underappreciated than the cardiovascular one. The relationship between metabolic dysfunction and cancer risk is now well established in the research literature. Poorly regulated blood sugar and chronic hyperinsulinemia are now associated with 8 forms of cancer. 8, including colorectal, breast, pancreatic, endometrial, liver, kidney, esophageal, and ovarian cancers. The mechanisms are multiple and complex, but some of the most interesting research focuses on the way certain tumor cells directly consume specific fuel sources, particularly lipids and fructose, to build their cell membranes and fuel their rapid proliferation. Some tumors have been found to preferentially utilize fructose, the form of sugar found abundantly in high fructose corn syrup and in large amounts of fruit juice, for biosynthetic processes that support their growth and metastasis. This doesn't mean sugar causes cancer in a simple, direct, linear way. Cancer is enormously complex. But it does mean that the metabolic environment you create in your body, through chronic high blood sugar, through hyperinsulinemia, through visceral adiposity, and the inflammatory signaling it generates, is a meaningful contributor to cancer risk and cancer progression. And perhaps most importantly, it means that managing your metabolic health is not just about avoiding diabetes or heart disease. It is about the full spectrum of chronic diseases that share a common upstream root in metabolic dysfunction. I want to address something now that I think is one of the most important and most underappreciated dimensions of the metabolic health crisis. And it requires us to be genuinely compassionate and honest at the same time. Why, if the information about sugar and metabolic health is increasingly available, do so many people continue to struggle? Why, even when someone clearly understands that their diet is harming them, do they find it so hard to change? For many people, the answer is not a lack of willpower. It is not laziness or moral failure. For a significant portion of the population, research suggests around 14%, the struggle with high-carbohydrate, ultra-processed foods is a clinical addiction. Not metaphorically, clinically. These foods trigger the same neural reward pathways, the dopaminergic circuits involving nucleus accumbens activity, mesolimbic signaling, as tobacco and alcohol. The brain scans of people consuming ultra-processed, high-carb, high-sugar foods show activation patterns that are essentially identical to those seen in substance-dependent studies. The craving, the loss of control, the failed attempts to moderate, the escalating use despite negative consequences. These are the hallmarks of addiction, not character flaws. To illustrate just how powerful this compulsion can become, consider this kind of case. A successful, high-functioning professional, someone with obvious intelligence and discipline in other areas of their life, who developed such an intense compulsion around bread that it became all-consuming. His family, desperate to stop the behavior, began spraying loaves of bread with liquid detergent and bleach to make them inedible. He ate them anyway. Standing at the bin at 4 a.m, eating bread soaked in household bleach, not because he wanted to, but because the neural pull was that overwhelming. That story is extreme, but the underlying mechanism is not unusual. It's just an unusually visible manifestation of something that plays out in milder but clinically significant ways for tens of millions of people who find themselves thinking about food constantly, eating past fullness repeatedly, feeling unable to stick to dietary changes despite genuine motivation. For these individuals, and I want to be very clear about this, the standard advice of just practice moderation is not helpful. It is, in fact, harmful, because it frames a neurobiological issue as a behavioral one and places the entire burden of failure on the individual. The more effective approach, both clinically and practically, is to recognize that for addiction-level responses, a strategy of abstinence from the triggering foods is often more successful than moderation. This is the same principle we apply in treating alcohol dependence. We don't tell an alcoholic to just have one drink. We help them remove the trigger entirely and build new patterns in its absence. And increasingly, there are medical tools that can support this process meaningfully. Two of the most powerful are continuous glucose monitors and GLP-1 receptor agonist medications. Continuous glucose monitors, CGMs, are small wearable devices that track blood glucose in real time, typically via a small sensor inserted just beneath the skin. What makes them so powerful, particularly for behavior change, is the immediacy and specificity of the feedback they provide. When you can see in real time, on your phone, exactly how a specific food affects your blood sugar over the following 2 hours, it transforms abstract health information into visceral personal data. Patients who use CGMs often describe a mirror moment, seeing the blood sugar spike from a food they thought was healthy, and feeling a motivation to change that no amount of verbal advice could generate. GLP-1 receptor agonists, medications like those in the class of semaglutide, have transformed metabolic medicine in recent years. These medications work through multiple mechanisms, but one of the most important and often underappreciated is their effect on the brain's reward circuitry. Many patients on these medications describe a profound quieting of food noise, the constant preoccupation with eating, the intrusive thoughts about specific foods, the compulsive urge to eat beyond hunger. For someone whose relationship with food has been hijacked by addiction-level neurochemistry, this reduction in craving noise can be the window through which genuine behavioral change becomes possible. The key principle here, and this applies whether someone uses pharmaceutical support or not, is that struggling with food is not a character deficiency. It is a biological reality, and treating it as a biological reality with compassion, with appropriate tools, with an honest assessment of what an individual actually needs, is the only approach that consistently produces lasting results. All right, let me bring everything together as we wrap up, because I don't want to leave you just with a picture of how bad things are. I want to leave you with a framework for what to actually do about it. The concept I want to end with is this. You have multiple possible health futures available to you right now, not one predetermined trajectory, multiple possibilities. And the path you end up on is shaped, in very large part, by the cumulative impact of the choices you make over the coming months, including, and this is not an exaggeration, the choice you make about what to eat today. To help translate that understanding into action, there's a framework called the GRIN model that I find genuinely useful, both for thinking about behavior change and for communicating it to patients. G is for goals, not vague, abstract goals like, I want to be healthier, specific, emotionally resonant, personally meaningful goals. The kind that connect your daily food choices to something you deeply care about. I want to have the physical capacity to walk my daughter down the aisle. I want to be able to play with my grandchildren without getting out of breath. I want to get off these medications and feel like myself again. When your goal is specific and emotionally alive, it functions as a navigational beacon, something you can return to when the default patterns are pulling you in a different direction. R is for resources. This is about taking an honest inventory of what you have going for you. Not what's working against you, but what's working for you. What have you successfully changed in your life before, and how did you do it? Who in your life can support this process? What professional resources, whether that's a functional medicine practitioner, a registered dietitian, a CGM, or appropriate medication. You don't have to do this alone. And recognizing that is not weakness, it's strategy. I is for increments. This is one of the most important pieces of the whole framework. The all-or-nothing approach to dietary change. The starting Monday, I'm going to completely overhaul my entire diet declaration, has an almost universally poor track record. What works far better is small, specific, sustainable increments. Not a complete dietary revolution. One swap. Today, instead of toast for breakfast, have eggs. Not because eggs are a magic food, but because that single swap removes 6 to 8 teaspoons of sugar from your morning blood glucose load and demonstrates to yourself that change is possible, that it doesn't feel as depriving as you feared, and that you can do it again tomorrow. Small wins compound. Identity shifts happen through accumulated small actions, not grand declarations. N is for noticing. This might be the most underutilized element of behavior change in mainstream medicine. We are very good at telling patients what to do. We are not always good at helping them notice and appreciate what's already changing. The clarity of thinking that often emerges within the first week of reduced glycemic load. The hunger between meals that begins to diminish. The sleep that gets a little deeper. The energy in the afternoon that used to flatline. These are real, measurable, meaningful changes, and actively noticing them, naming them, perhaps writing them down, transforms them from transient experiences into evidence. Evidence that the change is working. Evidence that the new path is worth staying on. So here's where I want to leave you. The world may be sleepwalking into a metabolic disaster. That part is true, and the data is unambiguous. But you don't have to be part of that statistic. Understanding what is actually in your food, the real glucose load, not the marketing label, is a form of power. The string test costs nothing and tells you something important about your visceral fat. The 100-day penalty for poorly controlled blood sugar should motivate anyone who hasn't yet made changes to start. And if food has felt like a compulsion rather than a choice, knowing that this is a biological reality, not a moral one, opens the door to genuinely effective intervention. The question I want you to sit with as you leave today is this. If you could see the different health futures available to you right now, mapped out in front of you based on the choices you make starting today, which one would you choose to walk toward? Because the answer to that question is available to you, and it might start with what you have for lunch. If this episode connected with you, please share it with someone you care about, because this information genuinely has the potential to change lives. Leave me a comment below with your biggest takeaway, or with a question you want me to dig into. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because we go deep on this science every week. Until next time, stay informed, stay intentional, and take good care of yourself.